Hi, I'm Kurt Von Diest for RGGEDU, and we're going to retouch some food photographs today. Okay, so we're looking at our bok choy here in Capture One, and Rob has given me 3 exposures, and he's told me on our cheat sheet, our list of direction, that this exposure, he's added a fill card, and that fills in this leaf nicely here. We have a second fill card image where the fill card's moved over a little bit, and there's just a little extra fill, but he's noted that he's not sure that that is really necessary. And then we have essentially our hero image with no fill card. So we're probably just going to work with these 2 images, the first one with the fill card and the second with no fill card. Now looking at this image, it has a crop on there, and the first thing that I'm going to do is remove that crop. Now Rob, when he's shooting on set, put the crop on there, may intend for that to be cropped like that in the future, but there's no sense in me processing it out with a crop already on there, because then if I wanted to change that crop later down the road, I would have a hard time with that. So I'm going to start with it uncropped, and knowing that we can crop it later in the future. So I have my 2 images here that we're going to work with, and now I need to process the raw file out into a TIFF file that I can edit in Photoshop. So I'm going to go to my Process tab in Capture One here, and I have a recipe created for what size of file I'm going to create. And you can see here that I am going to process this in 16-bit, and we're doing it in Adobe RGB. And I've processed it out to be 120% of the capture size. I tend to do that 120, 130%, depending on how many megapixels the camera is. I like to be close to 200 megabytes for a 16-bit file in Photoshop. I just find that that's kind of the optimal size to work with for all sorts of outputs. And I'm going to choose to open this in Adobe Photoshop Creative Cloud 2014, which is the version of Photoshop that we're using, the most current one. And so when I process these, you could say process here. I'm going to hit Command D to process it, and it'll open automatically in Photoshop. So I have it in tabs. I like to look at things not in tabs. It's my preference, so I can see them side by side. And so the image without the fill card is our hero image. So I'm going to take our fill card image, and with my Move tool, which is the very top tool, cursor tool in Photoshop, I'm going to click and drag over into the other document. Now it's very important, before I let up, I want to be sure that I'm holding down the Shift key. And what that does is it allows the one image to move into the other and line them up based on the outside dimensions of the image. If I didn't do that and I just drug it over, my 2 images would not line up. So having them lined up based on the size of the file is going to be very helpful for blending this. So now I have my 2 images stacked in my Photoshop document as 2 layers. I could even name this Fill. And now I'm done with this document, so I'm going to go ahead and close that. So now that I have my 2 images stacked in Photoshop, now I just need to combine them. And so I'm going to do this with a layer mask. A layer mask is the part of Photoshop that allows you to selectively, in a small area or large area, decide which part of this layer is visible. And the layer mask you get to at the bottom of the layers palette is the way that I'll get to it. There's a white square with a gray circle. And if I click that, it adds this little thumbnail to this layer. And you see that the layer is white, which means that this image is showing everywhere. If there is black on this thumbnail, then that means this layer is not visible in that place. So to start with, I'm going to flip this mask to black. So I'm going to mask it off completely. And I'm going to do that by hitting Command I, which is inverting that mask. You could also fill with black with your paint bucket tool, or Command Delete to fill with your background color. Now that my mask is black, you see that this fill layer has no effect when I turn it off and on. And now it's all set up for me to get my paintbrush and paint white to reveal this fill on the leaf. So with the paintbrush and masking, it's nice to do this slowly so you have more control over how it's masking on. So I want to be sure that I have a low opacity. Let's do 20%. And remember that if I'm painting black, I'm taking it off. If I'm painting white, I'm painting it on. And X is the keyboard shortcut to toggle between those two. So with my brush at 20% and hardness all the way down, so that the edge of the brush is nice and soft, I'm just going to paint white to tease in a little bit of that fill onto our leaf. And if I accidentally paint in some of the fill card, I'll hit X to toggle back to black, just switching between my foreground and background colors, and now can paint black to remove that little bit of fill card. Okay, so this image it's a pretty simple image, and I just want to make a small push to simplifying it even more. So now I'm going to zoom in here and do a little bit of cleanup on my image. So I've made a blank layer, and I'm going to name this Cleanup. Now, a lot of people have learned to do clone stamping and cleanup work by duplicating the background layer. But that is not the way that I like to do it. I like to do it with a blank layer. And the trick for this is that you need to be sure that your clone stamp tool is set to sample current and below. If it's set to current layer, which is default in Photoshop, it's not going to work because it's ignoring all the layers beneath, so you're just cloning nothing over nothing. With this set to current and below, it's going to work great. So I'm basically just cloning out anything that catches my eye that's not important. So there's a little white highlight thing that catches something, a little part of the leaf that catches the highlight that I'm going to remove. And it also has a counterpart in the reflection, so I'm going to remove that. I like to use the clone stamp at a lower opacity, again, so that gives me a little bit more control because it allows the cloning to happen slower. And when it's slower, I have a little bit more control because it builds up the move over multiple clicks of the mouse. So I'm working my way through the image, and every time I come to a new place, I'm holding down the Option key to define a new source point. So I'm cloning from A to B, and continually as I go around the image, I'm changing that source point. That is the trick to doing cloning where you don't get repeating patterns. So getting all the little hits of white that just kind of catch my eye. There's just a little brown thing there that looks just a little out of place. So I'm going to clone it out. So cloning is something that happens in every image, so practice makes perfect. You may prefer to use one of the healing tools. The spot healing tool can do great things in a lot of cases. But I tend to prefer the good old-fashioned clone stamp because there's no blending happening. It's doing exactly what I tell it to, so it's my control to how it blends based on how I work with the tool and what opacity I have it set to. But as long as you're doing one of the healing tools or clone tools, and you're making sure that you're not doing it to your background layer, you should be fine. It's the great thing about Photoshop is there's a lot of redundancy. So if you use the healing tool and that works for you, then that's great. I use the clone stamp tool because that works for me, and that's also great. Okay, so looking at my image here, I have all the little imperfections cleaned up, and I'm just noticing a couple of things that catch my eye. This leaf here catches the light, and my eye just really goes to that place. So I'm going to make a new layer and for this adjustment, and I'm still using my clone stamp tool, but I'm going to go down to like 10% opacity. And I'm just going to clone a little bit of this darker color over this. And if I turn this layer off and on, you see that that essentially is burning down that area a little bit. It's just taking some of the highlight away. Now, no image is complete without adding a little bit of refinement for exposure and contrast. And we're going to do that with curves. So when I open up a curves, I like to just add a point and kind of experiment with the picture and kind of see what fidelity is there. What areas do I like when it's brighter? What areas do I like when it's darker? And one thing that I think about this image is that I prefer the reflection to be a little bit more subtle. So I'm going to add a point that's just pulling down the midtones, kind of in the middle of my curves. And now I want to put that in selectively where I want it. So just like we did with our fill layer, I'm going to flip this mask to black, which is Command-I, or just fill with black. And now I'm going to paint white to reveal this adjustment where I want to see it. So I'm painting white onto my layer mask, but the effect is that I'm seeing that adjustment in that area. And again, if I go too far, I can hit the X key and just paint it off. Just like the Karate Kid, paint on, paint off. And so this is a small move. It just kind of helps keep the eye up in the hero part of the image by taking a little emphasis off of the extreme part of that reflection. And so I like that. So now I'm going to move on and see what another curves adjustment will give me. So this time I'm going to add a little bit of contrast by adding a point and bringing it up in the highlight part of the curves, and adding a point and bringing it down just a little bit. Once I have the point there that's active, I can use my keyboard arrow keys to kind of nudge it up and down and left and right in a more fine way than I can do with my mouse. So just a little bump of contrast brings the greens a little richer and nicer. And so again, I'm going to flip that mask to black and paint it in where I like to see it. Even though I do like this one mostly overall, but I do just get in the habit of painting in adjustments. It's just another layer of refined control that I have. Now I find that once I've added a little bit of contrast, my eye starts to get caught up in a few different places. And this section of this back leaf is still a little bright to my eye, and I think when I added some contrast, it really started to be a little more confusing. So I'm going to come down under my curves layers and add another blank layer and clone out just a little bit of that. I'm going to add another curves layer that this time is brightening quite a bit, and I'm going to use this as a dodge. I'm going to flip this mask to black again. So this layer is set up to dodge. And with a nice small brush and a really low opacity, 10%, I'm going to use this just to dodge out very lightly some of the detail of this front leaf, because that's where a lot of the character of this bok choy is. Just by adding a little bit of highlight there, just brightening up the highlight side of these veins, I'm going to feel all of that detail more in the full image. I could also do the same with another curves. This time, pull a point down and use it as a burn layer. Now, this is a pretty simplistic way of looking at burning and dodging, of which there are many methods in Photoshop. And as we go through some of the images in this tutorial, we may look at some different ways. But we always want to be doing burning and dodging as a component of adjustment layers, of curves layers, or some sort of layers. There's really no point to using the burn and dodge cursor tools, because that you have to do to a layer of pixels, and it's pretty limited in what you can do. So now if I hold down my Option key and click on the visibility of my background layer, it's going to toggle all my layers off. And again, doing the same thing, Option key and clicking the visibility of my background layer, it's going to turn them all back on again. So I can kind of see before and after my progress in Photoshop. And I like that I'm seeing the underside of this leaf now, but one thing I notice is that the fill card added in kind of a cool tone to this bottom leaf. Where the rest of the bok choy is nice and green, there's a little bit more cyan, a little bit more of a blue color cast here where that fill card was. And so I'm going to rectify that by making a blank layer. And I'm going to change the blending mode. In Photoshop, blending modes are a source of a lot of control and a lot of frustration for people that aren't sure what they do. And I think with blending modes, just do what you learn and don't worry about everything else. But this is also a place that you can play with a lot of stuff in Photoshop. I'm going to put the blending mode on color. And essentially what this means is this layer is only going to affect the color of my image. It's only going to blend with what's beneath it based on the color. Now with my paintbrush tool, I can sample a good green color, holding down the Option key to sample that. And now I'm just going to paint in that green color here and there, where I see some of that blue cast. And I can pick up different green colors if it starts getting a little too monochromatic, and turn that off and on and see the small change that it has. Now remember here, in this tutorial, we're just going for a small boost to a more commercial output. We're not going Photoshop heavy, so I'm not going to do any sort of crazy effects. Now the last thing I'm noticing is that I'd like to see the outer shape of the back side of this bok choy just a little bit. It gets a little lost in the shadows here, and where it meets the horizon line, there's not really a horizon line here, but we know there is some sort of horizon because we see the reflection. But I think if I see the back side of the shape a little bit, it'll feel a little more whole. So I can go to find my layer where I was dodging. And if I shift click this mask, I can see what effect that has. Maybe that would bring it up enough. And see where I need that to be. Let's pull it up where I just see a hint of the outside of that shape of the bok choy. And I'm going to hit Command-I and paint it in. Just so I see a little hint of that shape. And with that adjustment, any other little parts that I just want to pull out of that background a little bit, I can just hit them just a little bit so that they separate from the background as well. Okay, so just checking my before and after, I see that I generally like where we are with it. The greens look nice. We have just a little refined shape through here, and this is toned down. I'm happy with it. I'm going to go ahead and save this Photoshop document so that I keep all of my layers.